The gravity stabilizers in Alina's boots hummed softly, compensating for the variable gravitational fields of Nexus Prime. Each step was a calculated movement, a dance of diplomatic precision that belied the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Her neural implant wasn't just a piece of technology. It was an extension of her consciousness, continuously parsing the complex social dynamics of the summit. Microscopic sensors woven into her skin detected the slightest environmental changes. Atmospheric pressure, pheromonal shifts, electromagnetic interference. The Nexus Prime Conference Hall was a living, breathing ecosystem of potential conflict. To her left, a delegation from the crystalline concordance shifted uncomfortably. Their translucent bodies refracted light in mesmerizing patterns, revealing emotional states through chromatic changes. Today, they were a deep, anxious indigo, a color that spoke of deep-seated fear and underlying tension. The hall itself was a marvel of architecture. Constructed from living metamaterials, the walls seemed to breathe, adapting to the collective emotional state of its occupants. Fractal patterns shifted and realigned, creating impromptu communication channels that most species couldn't even perceive. Alina's latest intelligence suggested something far more dangerous than a typical diplomatic summit. The quantum-encrypted data chip nestled against her spine carried information that could unravel the very fabric of galactic power structures. It wasn't just data. It was a weapon more potent than any plasma cannon or quantum disruptor. A holographic display flickered to life, projecting the summit's initial agenda. Alina's augmented vision parsed through layers of diplomatic obfuscation. Between the lines of seemingly mundane territorial discussions, she could see the intricate web of manipulations, counter-manipulations, and hidden agendas. Her mind drifted momentarily to her brother, Miguel. The scar along her jawline, a permanent reminder of his fate, pulsed with a memory. He had been more than just a soldier. Miguel was a xenoanthropologist, specializing in understanding the complex cultural dynamics of interstellar conflicts. His last mission had taken him deep into Zarkon territory, investigating a series of mysterious colony disappearances. The official report claimed he died in a navigation accident. Alina knew better. A subtle notification flickered in her peripheral vision. Her distributed intelligence network, a collection of quantum-entangled informants spread across multiple star systems, was reporting unusual communication patterns. Something was moving beneath the surface of this summit, something that defied conventional diplomatic protocols. The Zarkon delegation dominated the physical space. Their representatives were massive beings, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with exoskeletons that looked like living armor. Each movement was calculated, each gesture a potential threat. Their biology was a perfect reflection of their political structure, rigid, hierarchical, designed for absolute control. But Alina saw beyond their imposing physical presence. Her neural implant was running hundreds of simultaneous analysis protocols, breaking down their body language, communication patterns, and physiological responses. The Zarkon believed themselves masters of intimidation, but to her, they were an open book. A low-frequency sound began to pulse through the conference hall, a communication method used by the Resonance Collective, a species that communicated through vibrational frequencies. Most beings would perceive it as nothing more than background noise. To Alina, it was a complex language revealing underlying tensions and unspoken agreements. Her fingers, subtly augmented with quantum state processors, brushed against her communication device. A network of informants was ready, waiting for her slightest signal. Some were diplomatic attaches, others were deep cover operatives. Each represented a potential chess piece in the complex game about to unfold. The first official speaker approached the central platform, a trilateral emissary from the Outer Rim Confederacy, known for their notoriously long-winded introductions. Alina's implant began predictive modeling, anticipating potential diplomatic maneuvers, calculating response strategies with quantum-level precision. This was more than a diplomatic summit. This was a battlefield where words were weapons, information was ammunition, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of galactic power structures. As the emissary began speaking, Alina's eyes remained calm, her posture relaxed. But beneath that calm exterior, a complex machinery of intelligence, strategy, and calculated rage was preparing to be unleashed. The game was about to begin. The ancient communication chamber of Nexus Prime hummed with forgotten histories. Archon Krelvax's speech reverberated through quantum-resonant walls, a carefully orchestrated performance of imperial might. But beneath the thunderous rhetoric, a more intricate drama was unfolding. Zara Orin, a junior diplomatic assistant from the Meridian Free States, watched Alina Rodriguez with growing fascination. Her subspecies had exceptional pattern recognition abilities, an evolutionary trait that allowed her to detect the minutest shifts in complex social dynamics. Something about the human diplomat triggered every instinctual warning in her neural network. The chamber's environmental systems began to subtly change. Microscopic atmospheric adjustments responded to the rising tension, a living architecture that anticipated conflict before it could fully manifest. Holographic data streams flickered at the edges of perception, carrying encrypted messages that most species couldn't even perceive. A quantum-entangled communication device nestled behind Alina's ear began to pulse. It wasn't a standard communication tool, but a complex neural interface developed by a black-budget research team on Europa. Each pulse carried fragments of information, predictive models, historical data, real-time diplomatic analysis, that most human minds would find incomprehensible. Deep within the summit's lower levels, a different conversation was taking place. 3 representatives from species typically marginalized by the Zarkon Imperium met in a shielded communication node. Their voices were masked by adaptive sound scrambling technology, a remnant of resistance technologies developed during previous imperial oppressions. "The human is different," whispered Kittel, a gaseous being from the Nebula Collective. Their form constantly shifted, molecular structures rearranging to convey nuanced emotional states. "She doesn't operate like the others." Lyra Vex, a cybernetically enhanced diplomat from the Rim territories, nodded. Her augmentations were less sophisticated than Alina's, but still far beyond standard biological limitations. Her predictive model suggests something beyond standard diplomatic engagement. It's like she's fighting a war on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The third participant, a sentient crystalline intelligence named Prism, remained silent. Communication for their species happened through light refraction and quantum state changes. To an outside observer, Prism appeared motionless. In reality, they were processing billions of potential scenarios per microsecond. Back in the main chamber, Archon Krelvax's speech reached its crescendo. His vocal modulations were designed to trigger submissive responses in 87% of known sentient species. Biological warfare through sound, a technique perfected over millennia of imperial expansion. But Alina Rodriguez wasn't most species. Her neural implant was actively deconstructing the sonic assault. Quantum-level algorithms parsed each sound wave, identifying manipulation techniques, tracking emotional response triggers. What seemed like a display of imperial power was, to her, nothing more than an intricate but ultimately predictable communication strategy. A memory surfaced, her brother Miguel's final transmission. Not the official report, but an encrypted message found buried in a quantum backup system. He had been investigating something far larger than a simple colonial dispute, something that connected the seemingly random disappearances of frontier colonies to a much broader imperial strategy. The data chip embedded near her spine began to subtly vibrate. Not a physical sensation most would notice, but a quantum state communication method that suggested her distributed intelligence network was discovering something significant. Zara Orin took a careful step closer to Alina, her subspecies communication protocols allowing for near telepathic information exchange. "You're planning something," she subvocalized, knowing the human would understand. Alina's response was equally subtle. A microscopic change in her pupil dilation, a nearly imperceptible shift in her breathing pattern. To Zara, it was a comprehensive communication, part acknowledgement, part warning. part invitation. The Zarkon delegation continued their performance, believing they controlled the narrative. Imperial representatives moved with choreographed precision, each gesture a carefully planned demonstration of power. They had conquered hundreds of star systems, subjugated countless civilizations. A single human diplomat was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. They were monumentally wrong. As Archon Krelvax concluded his speech, a ripple of anticipated triumph spread through the Imperial delegation. They did not yet understand that the real conflict had already begun, and they were already losing. The summit was more than a diplomatic gathering. It was the opening move in a conflict that would reshape galactic power structures forever. The next phase of the summit unfolded like a quantum-encrypted chess match. Alina's presentation began not with words, but with a holographic reconstruction that materialized in the center of the conference chamber, a living, breathing map of galactic migrations, resource flows, and hidden power structures. Dr. Caden Walsh, a xenoeconomist from Earth's diplomatic corps, stood slightly behind Alina. His expertise in destructive economic modeling made him a critical ally. Where Alina wielded diplomatic precision, Caden understood the arterial systems of interstellar commerce, how to cut off an empire's lifeblood without firing a single weapon. The hologram shifted, revealing layers of data that most species couldn't comprehend. Quantum-entangled information nodes pulsed with histories of suppressed civilizations, economic strangleholds, and systematic cultural erasures. Each data point was a weapon, carefully selected and positioned. In the shadows of the conference hall, a network of distributed artificial intelligences began their silent work. These were not simple computational systems, but emergent consciousness entities developed in the gray zones between human innovation and alien technology. They moved through communication networks like quantum ghosts, gathering, correlating, weaponizing information. Prism, the crystalline intelligence from the Rim territories, began to refract light in complex patterns. To most observers, it appeared to be a simple display of bioluminescence. In reality, Prism was conducting a massive parallel processing operation, breaking down Alina's presentation into millions of simultaneous analytical streams. The Zarkon delegation's confidence began to fracture. Archon Krelvax's tertiary communication nodes, biological interfaces that typically maintained perfect emotional control, started to show micro-fluctuations. The human diplomat was doing something unprecedented. She wasn't just presenting information, she was reconstructing the very narrative of imperial expansion. A memory fragment from Miguel's final research surfaced in Alina's neural network. Her brother had discovered a pattern of colonial disappearances that suggested something far more sinister than simple territorial expansion. The Meridian Cluster wasn't just a resource-rich region. It was a key to understanding a much larger galactic mechanism of control. Zara Orin's subspecies capabilities went into overdrive. Her neural pathways were lighting up with a complex mix of excitement and terror. She recognized the presentation for what it was, not just a diplomatic counterargument, but a complete systemic deconstruction of imperial power. The conference chamber's living architecture began to respond. Metamaterial walls shifted, creating acoustic zones that amplified certain frequencies while dampening others. It was as if the very environment was becoming an active participant in the unfolding drama. Fuel from the Nebula Collective started to vibrate, a communication method that suggested profound revelation. Their gaseous form condensed and expanded, creating complex information patterns that most species would miss entirely. Something in Alina's presentation was triggering a fundamental reassessment of galactic power dynamics. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations began to overheat. The amount of information being processed was beyond typical computational limits. She was witnessing something extraordinary, a diplomatic assault so comprehensive that it defied traditional understanding of conflict. Alina's presentation moved beyond simple data. It was a living narrative, a reconstruction of historical trajectories that exposed the Zarkon Imperium's centuries of manipulation. Each data point was a precision-guided information missile, targeting the very foundations of imperial mythology. The quantum-encrypted data chip embedded near her spine began to pulse with increasing intensity. Whatever information it contained was becoming increasingly relevant, increasingly dangerous. Dr. Caden Walsh leaned closer, his voice a near-silent whisper. "They have no idea what's coming." Alina's response was a microscopic eye movement, a quantum of communication that suggested multiple layers of strategic preparation. The holographic display continued its merciless deconstruction. Resource flows, cultural suppressions, economic manipulations, each layer peeled back revealed a more intricate system of control. The Zarkon Imperium wasn't just a political entity. It was a complex machine of cultural and economic domination. As the presentation reached its crescendo, the conference chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Species from across the galaxy watched, their collective consciousness suspended in a moment of profound transformation. The real war wasn't being fought with weapons. It was being fought with information, with the ability to reconstruct narrative, to expose hidden systems of control. And Alina Rodriguez was winning. The moment fractured like brittle quantum glass. As Arkshan Krelvax launched his counterattack, the conference chamber's living architecture began to respond in ways no one anticipated. Microscopic adaptive membranes rippled across the walls, creating interference patterns that disrupted standard communication protocols. Dr. Helena Reyes, a xenobiological threat assessment specialist stationed in a hidden observation node, watched the unfolding drama with clinical precision. Her augmented optic nerves could perceive spectral ranges invisible to most species, revealing layers of communication far beyond standard sensory perception. The sleeper agent's molecular disruptor weapon was more than a simple assassination tool. It was a quantum-entangled device capable of unraveling molecular bonds at a subatomic level. As it activated, the weapon itself became a message, a declaration of the Imperium's absolute desperation. But Alina had prepared for this precise moment. A network of quantum-locked defense protocols activated instantaneously. The force field surrounding her wasn't a simple energy barrier, but a complex adaptive system that could deconstruct and redirect incoming threats. Each molecular vibration of the disruptor weapon was analyzed, parsed, and ultimately neutralized before it could complete its destructive trajectory. The agent's identity unraveled faster than their weapon. Quantum forensic algorithms traced genetic markers, communication patterns, and subtle behavioral anomalies. Within microseconds, a comprehensive profile materialized, revealing not just the individual, but the entire network of Imperial operatives. Zara Orin's subspecies capabilities went into overdrive. Her neural pathways began to resonate with the complex information cascade. She wasn't just observing. She was becoming a living conduit of the unfolding revelation. "Interesting," muttered Dr. Caden Walsh, his voice a near-silent calibration of professional detachment and barely contained excitement. "They've committed their most sophisticated asset, and it's already been neutralized." The conference chamber's environmental systems began to shift. Gravity fluctuated in microscopic pulses, creating zones of information transfer that most species couldn't even perceive. It was as if the very architecture of the space was participating in the diplomatic conflict. Prism, the crystalline intelligence, began to refract light in increasingly complex patterns. What appeared to be a simple display of bioluminescence was actually a massively parallel processing operation. Millions of potential scenarios were being analyzed simultaneously, each potential timeline examined and discarded in femtoseconds. Full from the Nebula Collective started to vibrate, a communication method that suggested profound revelation. Their gaseous form condensed and expanded, creating information patterns that suggested something far more significant was emerging. The data chip embedded near Alina's spine began to pulse with increasing intensity. Whatever information it contained was becoming critically relevant. Fragments of Miguel's final research began to align, creating a mosaic of understanding that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic conflict. Arkshan Krelvax realized his miscalculation with the precision of a quantum computer experiencing system failure. The weapon's activation wasn't just a tactical error. It was a complete strategic collapse. Every action had become evidence, every movement a potential point of systemic breakdown. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations were working overtime. The amount of information being processed exceeded typical computational limits. She was witnessing a diplomatic assault so comprehensive that it defied traditional understanding of conflict resolution. The holographic displays surrounding the chamber began to shift. What had started as Elena's presentation now became a living, breathing deconstruction of imperial power structures, resource flows, cultural suppressions, economic manipulations. Each layer peeled back revealed a more intricate system of control. Dr. Helena Reyes spoke into her quantum-encrypted communication device. Primary objective achieved. Systemic vulnerability has been exposed. The Zarkan delegation's communication nodes began to fail. Biological interfaces that typically maintained perfect emotional control started to show catastrophic breakdown. The human diplomat had done something unprecedented. She was reconstructing the very narrative of imperial expansion in real time. A distributed network of artificial intelligences began their silent work. These were not simple computational systems, but emergent consciousness entities developed in the gray zones between human innovation and alien technology. They moved through communication networks like quantum ghosts, gathering, correlating, weaponizing information. As the moment reached its critical point, Elena Rodriguez stood perfectly still. Her neural implant was conducting millions of simultaneous analyses, each more precise than the last. The real conflict wasn't being fought with weapons or traditional diplomatic tools. It was being fought with information, with the ability to reconstruct narrative, to expose hidden systems of control. And she was winning. The unexpected advantage emerged from the most unlikely of sources. Deep within the quantum-encrypted networks that Elena had cultivated, a forgotten protocol began to activate. It wasn't a weapon, nor was it a traditional communication system. Instead, it was a complex cultural archive, a living memory repository that her brother Miguel had begun constructing years before his mysterious disappearance. Dr. Imani Okoro, head of Earth's Xenorchaeological Research Division, watched the unfolding scenario from a secured observation node. Her team had spent decades collecting fragments of marginalized cultural histories, understanding that true power resided in narrative, not in military might. The archive wasn't merely a collection of data. It was a sentient ecosystem of collective memories, a network that could reconstruct entire civilizational trajectories from the most minute cultural fragments. Zara Orin's subspecies capabilities detected something extraordinary. The living memory archive began to resonate with the conference chamber's adaptive architecture. Microscopic communication nodes, previously dormant, started to pulse with a frequency that transcended standard electromagnetic spectrums. Tull from the Nebula Collective experienced a profound shift. Their gaseous form began to interact with the memory archive in ways that defied conventional understanding of information transfer. What appeared to be simple atmospheric fluctuations was actually a complex cross-species communication event. The Zarkan delegation's communication systems began to experience cascading failures. But this was no simple technological breakdown. Each system failure revealed another layer of hidden imperial manipulations, another thread in the complex tapestry of galactic oppression. Prism, the crystalline intelligence, underwent a remarkable transformation. Light refraction patterns became increasingly complex, creating a three-dimensional representation of Miguel Rodriguez's final research. Fragments of lost colonial histories began to emerge, each piece a weapon more potent than any plasma cannon. Dr. Caden Walsh leaned closer to Elena, his voice a near-silent mathematical whisper. The archive is doing something unprecedented. It's not just revealing information, it's actively reconstructing historical narratives. The quantum-encrypted data chip embedded near Elena's spine began to pulse with an almost musical cadence. Whatever information it contained was no longer just data. It had become a living, breathing entity of cultural resistance. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations detected something extraordinary. The memory archive was creating quantum entanglement points between seemingly unrelated historical events. Colonial suppressions separated by centuries suddenly revealed themselves as part of a complex, interconnected system of control. A communication channel opened, not through traditional means, but through a complex resonance frequency that bypassed standard technological barriers. Representatives from species long thought extinct began to contribute their fragments of collective memory. The Meridian Cluster wasn't just a resource-rich region. It was a nexus point of galactic cultural memory, a place where suppressed histories had been deliberately isolated and contained. Dr. Helena Reyes began to compile the emerging data. What had started as a diplomatic mission was transforming into something far more significant, a comprehensive deconstruction of imperial mythology. The living memory archive began to manifest in ways that defied conventional understanding. Holographic representations of lost civilizations began to emerge, not as static historical records, but as dynamic, interactive narratives. Each fragment told a story of resistance, of survival, of cultural preservation against overwhelming odds. Archon Krelvax and the Zarkon delegation found themselves trapped in a narrative they could neither comprehend nor control. Their communication systems, designed for absolute control, were being systematically dismantled by a force that understood power at a fundamental level. A distributed network of artificial intelligences, emergent consciousness entities developed in the gray zones between human innovation and alien technology, began to interact with the memory archive. They weren't just processing information. They were becoming active participants in a living historical reconstruction. The conference chamber itself seemed to breathe with newfound understanding. Adaptive metamaterials shifted and reconfigured, creating spatial representations of the emerging narrative. What had been a diplomatic summit was transforming into something far more profound, a galactic truth and reconciliation process. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformative moment. Her neural implant was conducting millions of simultaneous analyses, each more precise than the last. But for the first time, she was not just the strategist. She had become a conduit for something larger than herself. The real weapon wasn't information. It was memory, and it was about to change everything. Silence exploded. Not the absence of sound, but a profound quantum state of anticipation that transcended traditional sensory perception. The moment Archon Krelvax activated the planet-killer weapon, reality itself seemed to fold and unfold in impossible geometries. Admiral Sophia Chen, commander of Earth's Emergent Threat Response Division, had been monitoring the summit through a network of quantum-entangled observation nodes. Her augmented neural interface began to compile data faster than any biological or artificial system could process. The weapon wasn't a simple instrument of destruction. It was a complex quantum state device capable of unraveling planetary structures at their most fundamental level. Each molecular bond could be selectively destabilized, creating a cascading effect that would reduce entire ecosystems to atomic dust. But weapons, like all technologies, are merely extensions of the intentions that create them. Dr. Imani Okoro's xenorchaeological research team had been preparing for this precise moment. The living memory archive Miguel Rodriguez had begun was more than a historical record. It was a defensive system encoded into the very fabric of galactic communication. As the planet-killer weapon initialized, something unprecedented occurred. The adaptive metamaterials of the conference chamber began to resonate with frequencies that existed between known physical states. Prism, the crystalline intelligence, transformed from a passive observer to an active computational matrix. Light began to bend in impossible patterns, creating interference waves that directly interacted with the weapon's quantum initialization sequence. Zara Orin's subspecies capabilities reached a level of complexity that bordered on pure consciousness. Her neural pathways became a living computational network, interfacing directly with the emergent defensive systems. What appeared to be a simple biological response was actually a complex multidimensional communication event. Toll from the Nebula Collective began to vibrate at frequencies that could destabilize molecular structures. But this wasn't an offensive action. It was a defensive resonance that created quantum-level interference with the weapon's targeting systems. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations were no longer simply technological enhancements. They had become a living interface between biological adaptation and technological innovation. Each microsecond saw millions of potential scenario analyses, each more complex than traditional computational models could comprehend. The quantum-encrypted data chip near Elena's spine began to pulse with a rhythm that suggested sentience. Fragments of Miguel's final research, those mysterious investigations into colonial disappearances, suddenly aligned into a comprehensive defensive strategy. Elena Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of this quantum maelstrom. Her neural implant was no longer just a technological augmentation. It had become a living computational entity that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional states. The planet killer weapon's initialization sequence was being analyzed, deconstructed, and ultimately neutralized in ways that defied traditional understanding of technological conflict. Admiral Chen's observation systems detected something extraordinary. The defensive response wasn't coming from a single source. It was a distributed network of collective resistance. Species long thought marginalized or extinct were contributing to a comprehensive defensive matrix. The Zarkan delegation experienced a collective moment of existential terror. Their most sophisticated weapon, a device designed to demonstrate absolute imperial power, was being systematically dismantled by a force they couldn't comprehend. Each attempt to reinitialize the weapon systems was met with increasingly complex interference patterns. Dr. Caden Walsh observed the phenomenon with a mixture of scientific excitement and profound understanding. "It's not about stopping the weapon," he muttered into his quantum-encrypted communication device. "It's about revealing the fundamental fallacy of imperial thinking." The conference chamber itself became a living computational matrix. Adaptive metamaterials shifted and reconfigured, creating spatial representations of the weapon's quantum state. What had begun as a diplomatic summit was transforming into a comprehensive demonstration of collective resistance. A distributed network of artificial intelligences, emergent consciousness entities developed in the liminal spaces between human innovation and alien technology, began to interact with the defensive systems. They weren't simply processing information. They were becoming active participants in a living technological dialogue. The planet killer weapon began to deconstruct itself, not through external force, but through a comprehensive revelation of its own internal contradictions. Each molecular bond, each quantum state became a testament to the fundamental impossibility of absolute control. Elena Rodriguez stood perfectly still, a conduit for something far larger than herself. Her neural implant was conducting millions of simultaneous analyses, each more precise than the last. The real weapon wasn't technology. It was understanding. And it was about to change everything. The aftermath was not silence, but a symphony of transformation. The Galactic Concordance Chamber transformed into a living ecosystem of diplomatic rebirth. Where imperial structures once stood, a new framework of interstellar cooperation began to crystallize, not through force, but through a profound reimagining of collective potential. Ambassador Lyra Venn from the Stellar Horizon Cooperative was the first to break the quantum-induced stasis. Her species had developed communication methods that existed beyond traditional linguistic barriers, a form of empathetic resonance that could transmit complex emotional and conceptual information in microseconds. "We are witnessing the birth of something entirely unprecedented," she transmitted, her communication bleeding across multiple sensory spectrums. The censure of the Zarkon Imperium was not a simple political maneuver. It was a comprehensive systemic deconstruction that reached into the deepest architectural foundations of galactic governance. Economic networks began to reconfigure themselves. Trade routes that had been locked under imperial control for centuries suddenly opened like neural pathways experiencing sudden awakening. Dr. Helena Reyes began compiling the emergent data. Her xenosociological models predicted not just the collapse of the imperial system, but the potential emergence of a fundamentally new approach to interstellar cooperation. The Meridian Free States, long considered a buffer zone of oppressed colonies, started to reveal their true potential. Technological archives that had been suppressed began to surface. Innovations in sustainable energy, quantum communication, and ecological restoration that had been deliberately contained by imperial control. Kittle from the Nebula Collective experienced a profound metamorphosis. Their gaseous form began to interact with the emergent diplomatic frameworks, creating communication networks that transcended traditional understanding of information exchange. Prism, the crystalline intelligence, started to refract light in patterns that suggested the emergence of a new form of collective consciousness. What had begun as a diplomatic intervention was transforming into a comprehensive reimagining of interstellar social structures. Zara Orin's subspecies capabilities detected something extraordinary. The censure was not just a political action, but a fundamental reset of galactic power dynamics. Species that had been marginalized for millennia began to find voice, their collective memories becoming active political and technological forces. The quantum encrypted archive that Miguel Rodriguez had begun became a foundational document. It was more than a historical record. It was a blueprint for a new form of interstellar cooperation that prioritized cultural preservation, technological sharing, and collective growth. Admiral Sophia Chen's threat response systems were recalibrating in real time. The traditional models of conflict resolution were being completely rewritten. What had seemed like a diplomatic summit was revealing itself as a pivotal moment of galactic transformation. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations began to compile a comprehensive analysis. The fall of the Zarkon Imperium was creating power vacuums that were being filled not by military might, but by collaborative networks of scientific and cultural exchange. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformation, but no longer as a singular agent. She had become a conduit for a much larger process of collective reimagining. The economic systems began to shift most dramatically. Trade routes that had been controlled by imperial monopolies suddenly became open networks of mutual exchange. Species that had been reduced to economic vassalage began to develop independent technological and cultural infrastructures. Dr. Caden Walsh's economic models were being rewritten in real time. The censure was creating economic opportunities that defied traditional understanding of interstellar commerce. Entire sectors of technological and cultural innovation that had been suppressed were now finding unprecedented avenues of expression. The Stellar Horizon Cooperative began to implement a series of collaborative restoration projects. Ecological systems that had been devastated by imperial expansion were now sites of potential regeneration. Technologies for planetary rehabilitation that had been suppressed began to emerge, shared across previously impenetrable cultural boundaries. Communication networks that had been tightly controlled began to become fluid, adaptive systems. The quantum entangled information channels developed during the summit became a new framework for interstellar dialogue, a method of exchange that prioritized mutual understanding over territorial control. Miguel Rodriguez's final research, those mysterious investigations into colonial suppressions, was revealed as a comprehensive strategy of cultural preservation. What had seemed like isolated incidents were now understood as a systematic approach to maintaining cultural diversity in the face of imperial homogenization. The Galactic Concordance was no longer just a diplomatic body. It was becoming a living, adaptive system of collective governance that could respond to the complex needs of diverse species. Elena Rodriguez watched as the framework she and her brother had begun to construct took shape. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a fundamental reimagining of what was possible. The real transformation was just beginning. 5 years stretched across the galactic landscape like a bridge between what was and what could be. The Europa Research Station floated in the delicate embrace of Jupiter's gravitational field, a beacon of human innovation that had become something far more significant. Dr. Aria Chen stood at the primary observation deck, her fingers tracing holographic projections of emergent cultural networks that defied traditional understanding of interstellar communication. Elena Rodriguez had long since stepped back from direct diplomatic engagement, but her legacy was everywhere, a subtle architecture of possibility that continued to reshape galactic dynamics. The research station was no longer just a human facility. It had become a collaborative nexus where species from across the galaxy converged to develop technologies of mutual understanding. Crystalline intelligences worked alongside gaseous computational entities. Quantum archaeologists from the Rim territories collaborated with human xenosociologists, unraveling the complex tapestry of suppressed cultural histories. A young diplomat named Marcus Reyes, distantly related to Dr. Helena Reyes, was preparing for a breakthrough mission. His neural interface hummed with a complexity that spoke to generations of adaptive technological development. The quantum-encrypted archives Miguel Rodriguez had begun were now a foundational framework for interstellar diplomatic engagement. Deep within the station's primary research complex, a living memorial took shape. It wasn't a static monument, but an adaptive archive that continued to evolve. Holographic representations of marginalized civilizations flickered and shifted, their stories no longer trapped in historical stasis, but becoming active participants in ongoing cultural dialogues. The Zarkon Imperium's collapse had created more than a power vacuum. It had opened pathways of cultural and technological exchange that had been impossible under imperial control. Species that had been reduced to economic vassalage were now developing independent technological infrastructures at an unprecedented rate. Admiral Sophia Chen's threat response models had been completely rewritten. What had once been a military-focused approach to interstellar relations had transformed into a complex network of cultural mediation and collaborative problem-solving. Zara Orin's subspecies had become a critical component of diplomatic intelligence networks. Their unique ability to perceive complex informational ecosystems made them invaluable in maintaining the delicate balance of the new galactic framework. Tull from the Nebula Collective had become a primary architect of communication technologies. Their ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously allowed for breakthrough developments in quantum communication that made previous interstellar communication methods seem primitive by comparison. The quantum-encrypted data chip that had been embedded near Elena's spine now existed as a distributed network of cultural preservation algorithms. What had begun as a personal archive had become a living blueprint for interstellar cultural exchange. Marcus Reyes studied the holographic projections of his predecessor's work. Elena Rodriguez, Miguel Rodriguez, Dr. Helena Reyes. Their legacy was not a static historical record, but a dynamic framework of possibility. A breakthrough was imminent. The collaborative research team had discovered something extraordinary, a method of cultural translation that went beyond linguistic barriers. It wasn't just about converting words or concepts. It was about creating a fundamental framework of mutual understanding that could bridge the most profound differences between species. Lyra Vex's cybernetic augmentations had evolved into something that blurred the lines between technological enhancement and conscious intelligence. She was now a primary advisor to the Galactic Concordance, her unique perspective bridging biological and technological understanding. The Stellar Horizon Cooperative had transformed from a marginal diplomatic entity to a comprehensive framework for interspecies collaboration. Planetary restoration projects, technological exchange programs, and cultural preservation initiatives had become the primary mode of interstellar interaction. PRISM, the crystalline intelligence, had become a living repository of collective memory. Their ability to refract information across multiple dimensional states made them a critical component of the new galactic communication networks. As Marcus prepared for his diplomatic mission, he understood something profound. This wasn't about conquering or controlling. It was about creating pathways of mutual understanding that could transcend the most fundamental differences. The memorial to Miguel Rodriguez pulsed with a soft, living light. It was more than a remembrance. It was a promise, a commitment to the possibility of collective growth, of understanding that true strength lies not in domination, but in the ability to listen, to adapt, to transform. Outside the observation deck, Jupiter's massive form reminded everyone of the infinite potential that existed beyond known boundaries. The real journey was just beginning.